All right, well, let's go ahead and get started because we've got a lot of great content to cover today. Welcome everyone to our webinar on intersectionality of nature access, equity, and biodiversity, which Audubon is hosting as part of the State of California's Biodiversity Week. My name is Megan Hurdle. I'm the Director of Land and Water Conservation with Audubon, California. We are really pleased to have a great set of presenters and panelists today who are going to be talking about an issue that's of incredible importance to Audubon. And that is how conservation, access to nature and the outdoors, and equity issues overlap and intersect. So we're going to hear from speakers who live and work in Los Angeles, near the Salton Sea, in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley, and in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they're all going to talk about the work that they are leading on equity and conservation, and why that matters to the biodiversity of California and beyond. But first, a few logistics. This webinar is being recorded and broadcast live both through Zoom and Facebook. If you have questions for our presenters, please feel free to drop it in the chat function on either Zoom or Facebook. If you are using Zoom, I would encourage you to make your chat questions available for all presenters and attendees so everyone can see what great questions you've got. We will have time at the end of the presentations for a Q&A with our panelists, and we hope to take some audience questions at that point, so please queue up your best questions for them. Thank you for joining us today and for your support of California's Biodiversity Week. Next slide, please. So before I pass this over to our presenters, a little background on why we're hosting this webinar. In 2018, Governor Brown launched the California Biodiversity Initiative. The goal of this initiative is really to secure California's invaluable biodiversity by incorporating it into our economic and environmental goals and efforts here in this state. This year, thanks to the leadership of the agencies listed on this slide, we are celebrating a full week of biodiversity with a wide range of presentations and events. If you want to find out more about what's happening and ways to participate, please use the link that's at the bottom of the screen to hear about the great things many organizations across California are hosting this week. Next slide, please. It is not at all surprising that California would focus on this type of initiative because California is a global biodiversity hotspot and is home to more species of plants and animals than any other state. Our state's economy, as well as the health of our communities and our families, is really linked with biodiversity and the health of our environment. And as wildfires burn through much of our state and much of the West Coast, that linkage, that connection of our human communities with how the natural world is doing, is really being called into stark contrast. So what is biodiversity? What does it mean? Well, biodiversity or biological diversity really refers to the wide variety of living things on Earth. That's plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, everything from the iconic California quail to the spiny sea urchins that you find off the coast of California. Biodiversity describes the wide range of life that this planet supports, and that includes all of us. So you might be asking then, well, how does biodiversity intersect with access to nature or equity issues? Next slide, please. Well, you will hear about this from our presenters, and I certainly don't want to steal any of their thunder. But it is really important that all of us know that while I think everybody on this presentation would say that it is a human right that all of us have equal access to clean air, clean water, nature, and the biodiversity that it supports, in fact, we don't all have equal access. A recent study by the Center for American Progress showed that 76% of people in the United States, particularly low-income non-white communities, are experiencing nature deprivation. In fact, communities of color are 3 times more likely than those white communities that surround them to not have access to natural areas. And this lack of equitable access has been shown by numerous studies to have serious impacts on both physical and mental health. There are many groups of people that have long been underrepresented in the environmental and conservation movement. The efforts that you're about to hear about are trying to change that. So it's our hope that you will walk away from today's presentations with a better understanding of why Audubon is advancing conservation work that focuses on equity and access, as well as ideas on what you can do to promote equity and access while protecting the biodiversity and the environment that is so important to all of us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, Pedro Hernandez. Pedro?
Okay, yeah, I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks and happy noon hour, everyone. My name is Pedro Hernandez. I am the Outreach and Engagement Manager for Climate Policies, which in a nutshell means I'm a community organizer for Audubon, California on several different climate issues. So I'll be discussing, just setting the context for the San Joaquin Valley for, some considerations that we always keep at the forefront for our statewide policy advocacy, and then just discuss a couple of different values that, Audubon, California as, a policy advocacy shop considers for, our statewide efforts. So next slide, please. So just to start things off, a theme that you'll hear, many times within the next hour is how the same places that birds depend on are, integral to community health as well too. And the San Joaquin Valley is certainly no exception. We're one of the most important stretches along the Pacific Flyway, which is the route essentially along the west coast of the Americas that, migrating birds, depend on for survival. But it's also a place of many environmental injustices and, several different causes of pollution, which, what I'll discuss, affect both community and birds. So next slide, please. Specifically, as a bird conservation organization, what it means for areas like Fresno County is that over 100 different species are at risk of extinction. And these are from causes of like wildfire, habitat loss, lack of water, lack of, food resources as well too. But more broadly, I would never have imagined a couple of years ago that the place that I live is such an important place in the world for birds. But this is, only one window to highlight how climate change is ultimately threatening overall biodiversity for the San Joaquin Valley. And, we turn on the news or, open Twitter and we can see that even, the creek fire here in Fresno County is 0% contained and, it's completely disruptive to both wildlife and human communities. Next slide, please. At the same time, issues like habitat conversion have also led to environmental injustices for human communities, and so in addition to the biodiversity concerns, human health is also is a component of biodiversity, and Audubon wants to make sure that we're serving the communities that we're working in as well too, and this means not ignoring the historical racism, diversement, and even political underrepresentation that have contributed to lack of access to green spaces, for example. In many cases, rural communities, only green space is within like orchards. And so folks need to, seek recreational opportunities, sometimes walking through almond orchards that are sprayed with pesticides like I did when I was a kid. Next slide, please. And even with the statewide records of wildfires, we've seen that, many communities and farm workers had still been working in the fields, forced to work there to make sure that the food chain was not entirely disrupted by the climate crisis. And so, although we can see all these issues in the news, it's very hard to distinguish what climate change is impacting, because it's impacting several things at the same time. Next slide. Which that leads me to, this quote, which is something from the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, which I think encapsulates a core value for Audubon. And I'll read it aloud. It's environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Just this very core concept, I think, is important for Audubon's overall policy advocacy and overall framework for issues that we support. Because ultimately, we know that protecting birds is protecting people and vice versa, because we're all dependent on the same ecosystems at the end of the day. And the overall ecosystem is threatened by climate change. So next slide. And what exactly we're doing for climate change through the policy shop is using our staff time and our advocacy efforts to support equity to address the historical racism that not only John James Audubon has perpetuated throughout history, but also for the conservation movement more wholly as well too. We're taking affirmative actions to address these historical discrepancies with tangible policy solutions and investments that would direct resources and restore the ecological functions of marginal and historically discriminated communities. And so this is going to be important for Audubon to survive as an organization, but it's also going to be important to build the movement that we need to get the climate victories that not only birds, but also people deserve. Because, you know, as we can see throughout the news, and, you know, it's no secret that we're experiencing a significant climate breakdown. And ultimately, I think maybe this joke is illegal to use at Audubon, but we can get two birds with one stone, you know, by co-valuing climate justice and the ecosystem and wildlife as well. So I'll pass it to, you know, my colleague Mika Perron, who is going to discuss some of our work in Los Angeles. But please, yeah, two birds, one stone. Yeah, if there are any questions, I'll be available at the end of this talk. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Pedro. Hi, everyone. My name is Mika. I work for the Audubon Center at Debs Park. We are located in Northeast Los Angeles on Tongva land. And today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of our work along the Los Angeles River. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So just to provide a little bit of an overview about the river itself, it is 51 miles. It runs from the mountains all the way through the heart of LA out to the coast at Long Beach. There's a consistent flow of mainly reclaimed water as well as urban runoff. Historically, the river was a really important natural resource for the Tongva community, which is the local indigenous community of this area. However, in the 1930s, the Army Corps of Engineers actually began channelizing the river with concrete. So by the time, this was in response to a series of devastating that were taking place. By the time this project was completed around the 1960s, almost the entire river looked like what you see in that top right photo there. Sorry, I just saw a chat. I work for the Audubon Center at Debs Park, located in Los Angeles, and I'm talking about the LA River. So there are also a couple portions of the river, which are what we refer to as soft bottom. So these are areas of the river where the concrete was not able to stay in place for a number of reasons. So you do see some habitat that looks a little bit more like what you would typically expect to find in a river. In the past few decades or so, the river has been a little bit ignored and definitely undervalued in terms of the amazing cultural and natural resource that it is. This is definitely changing. There's a lot of investment right now from both LA City as well as LA County to really develop some more green infrastructure along the river, to build some more parks and to make it more accessible, and to really just recognize the amazing resource that it is. It runs through a number of really diverse communities throughout LA County. And so it's kind of this incredible resource in terms of connecting people to nature and also connecting people to each other. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I am going to talk a little bit about the biodiversity along the LA River. So almost 100% of the original habitat has been lost due to that channelization that I just talked about, as well as urbanization. However, the river is still very biodiverse. There is a really interesting mix of native and non-native plant species because of its urban setting. This is especially in that soft bottom portion of the river that I mentioned. There's also a really wide variety of bird species that can be found in the river as well. We see a lot of herons, a lot of egrets. We've seen yellow warblers, yellow-breasted chats. We've even seen Leisfel's vireo, which is actually an endangered species. If we could go to the next slide, I will talk a little bit about our work along the river. So our center is actually located a couple miles away from the river, but it was really important to us to get involved in working along the river because of this amazing potential that it has in terms of both bird habitat as well as community engagement. So what we were able to do is adopt a number of pocket parks along the river in partnership with some local park agencies. And we've been able to work out of those parks to enhance the habitat and also offer community programming. So we offer a wide variety of programs. This is all pre-COVID, a lot of hands-on volunteer opportunities. We do biking and birding events, a lot of bird walks. We've done kayaking and birding. So we always try to make all of our programming as accessible as possible. So it's always free. We always provide all the materials needed. We try to offer bilingual Spanish-English programming whenever possible. And it's really important to us that we take this kind of holistic approach to our conservation work, meaning that while we are working to enhance the habitat for birds along the river, we're also working to engage the community and provide them with opportunities to really connect with the land in their area, with the goal of this really being to build this network of community stewards who can really serve to advocate for the river for generations to come. We also try to attend as many neighborhood council meetings as possible. We've been able to develop some really strong partnerships with some local community groups as well. So we just really try to make sure that we are engaging with the community throughout the entire process, and that we're really able to get a good sense of what the community's needs are, as well as some of their potential concerns, which brings me to the next slide here. So I wanted to highlight a really awesome project that we've been able to work on with some Prop 1 funding in partnership with a couple other local organizations. And the project is this Anti-Displacement Toolkit and Guide. So essentially what it is kind of a comprehensive resource for park developers, for city and county officials, for other NGOs, and community advocates to engage in equitable green infrastructure development. So in working with the community, a concern that we heard a lot was this very real fear that, you know, all this investment in the river, all these new parks and things like that could potentially lead to displacement of the local communities along the river. So this is something that we've seen happen across the country, where even if these projects are oftentimes well-intentioned, a lot of these green development projects lead to rising housing costs in the area, which ultimately leads to the displacement of the communities that these projects were originally intended to benefit. So I think maybe an anti-displacement toolkit isn't something that an Audubon Center would typically take the lead on, but it was really important to us to address this community concern that we heard and to provide developers with really tangible tools and resources that they can use to really invest in the communities where these projects are taking place. And this all kind of goes back to that holistic approach to conservation that I was mentioning, where, you know, we're really trying to build this network of community stewards. And so if those community members are then displaced, it's obviously not a very sustainable strategy. So it was very important to us that we develop this guide to complement our habitat enhancement work. So I think just kind of in summary, and thinking about how biodiversity intersects with access and with equity, our work along the river is a pretty good example of how you can work to increase biodiversity within an urban setting while also working to prioritize people and equity and community engagement throughout the entire process. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank at the Salton Sea.
Thank you, Mika. My name is Frank Ruiz, and I am the Salton Sea Program Director for Audubon, California. What you see here is the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea is perhaps the perfect example of the water crisis in the West, plagued with communities filled with inequalities and inequities. The Salton Sea is the largest body of water in California, and arguably one of the most important areas for birds along the Pacific Flyway. Next, please. The Salton Sea is the last iteration of the ancient Cahuilla Lake, which has been a part of these regions for eons. The ancient Cahuilla Lake last appearance was in the 1600s, and at one point, the largest lake in North America. It extended from north of Mexico, all the way up to Palm Springs. The Salton Sea was created as we know it. The Salton Sea was created in 1905 when heavy rainfall and snowmelt caused the Colorado River to swell, and the newly built canals broke off, flooding the whole Salton Sea for the next 18 months, giving as a result what we call it the Salton Sea, the modern day Salton Sea. The Salton Sea is a terminal lake with a salinity levels of 62 to 69 parts per thousand, almost twice the salinity of the ocean. And for some of you that perhaps are not familiar where, geographically where the Salton Sea is, it is located between two counties in Southern California, 45 miles north of Mexico, between Riverside County and Imperial County. The Salton Sea is a terminal lake. That means, that the only water that comes into the Salton Sea is mainly fed by Colorado water. It is 35 miles long by 15 miles wide. The Salton Sea annually receives approximately 700 to 800,000 acre-feet of water, but it loses about 1.3 million acre-feet of water in evaporation alone. And the Salton Sea has a lot of cultural relevance, especially for the local folks. If you hear someone saying that the Salton Sea was an accident, you have to ask the Native American communities that live around here, and they will tell you that the Salton Sea has always been there. The water has always been there because it's been there, for years and years. It has shaped the landscape of the region. In the 1950s and 60s, the Salton Sea used to be called the California Riviera. It used to be the main attraction for Southern Californians, Hollywood luminaries, and so forth. Next, please. The Salton Sea, as you see it, it's not an isolated body of water. It is intrinsically connected to the saline lakes on the west side, on the west hemisphere, and it is part of the Western water networks. So there is an intrinsically connection to the watersheds on the west. Next, please. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Salton Sea used to be the main attraction. It changed the landscape of the region. A lot of the cattle ranches that were around the Salton Sea were relocated because it was the main attraction. It created not only recreation opportunities, it created economic opportunities for the region. It was so vibrant for the birds, but just probably 50 or 60 years later, this is what we have. Next, please. We have now one of the worst environmental, public health, and economic crisis in the West, probably in modern history. Only 60 years later, this is what we have. We have communities that are dealing with probably one of the highest unemployments in California, dealing with one of the worst public health issues. If you ask the communities around the Salton Sea, they will complain of nosebleeds. We have some of the highest asthma and COPD rates in the state of California, unemployment rates, housing prices are plummeting because the region has lost, the tourism is now becoming one of the worst environmental and public health crisis. We don't have no political leverage. Tourism is almost absent. And why this situation was created? The environmental crisis was created due to water loss, water evaporation, water diversion. It is exposing a lot of lake beds. It is creating this huge economic crisis for the local communities. And this is the reason why, next please, this is the reason why Audubon decided to create and customize an approach that allows us to be relevant in the community. This is, how Audubon decided to approach it. We created a program, that combines science, policy, community engagement, and education. We feel, that communities need to be enfranchised. The inequalities, the inequities that communities are dealing with are exacerbating the crisis that the Salton Sea is creating, nowadays. So how do we move the political needle? How do we engage to educate communities, enfranchise different voices. We combine the programs that we have on science with the programs, you know, that we have on policy. We created education opportunities for Latino kids, working with different high schools, bringing different voices, different sectors from the community, from businesses, education entities, businesses, chambers, healthcare industries, etc. Why? Because, you know, we understand, next please, that this is not an isolated issue. The environmental issues are highly connected to public health and economic issues. This is how we are now, this is what we're expecting. And in this slide, you see that these are some of the things, you know, that we can do, some of the feasible things, right? The state of California created a program that is called the 10-year program that has the purpose of building dust suppression programs. 30,000 acre feet of dust suppression programs will be established in the next 10 years. Half of them, hopefully, will be habitat for the birds. What is unfeasible? It's unfeasible to bring water from the Sea of Cortez or the Pacific Ocean. What is quasi-feasible with the perimeter lake? A lot of people talk about bringing water and just covering some of the playa around the Salton Sea, which is, you know, really challenging. What is needed? What is needed is a better integration of the different entities, different agencies, groups, NGOs, CBOs, so many different groups that are working around the Salton Sea. And another thing that is needed is the need of highly enfranchising the communities, the different voices that we have around the Salton Sea, and a good communication program, good communication efforts to make sure, you know, that we engage, we inform, we educate the communities that we work with, and hopefully this way we will be able to continue moving the needle and bring attention, bring the much needed funding that is needed in franchise communities, and allow birds and people to continue thriving for years to come. Now, this time I will pass it on to my colleague, Casey.
Thank you so much, Frank. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Casey Arndt, and I am the Center Director for the Richardson Bay Audubon Center and Sanctuary. We're a field office located in the Bay Area for Audubon, California. And today I'll be discussing some of the inclusive work we're leading in the Bay Area. But before I go into more detail, I would like to make a land acknowledgement recognizing the indigenous people of the center's land, the coastal Miwok. Next slide. At the center, we strive to make our engagement work as equitable, accessible, and inclusive as possible, from the young people we work with to the contractors we hire. Beginning with our youngest people, our summer camp is fully inclusive of children of all abilities. Our programs are modified as needed to include opportunities for everyone to participate. This includes things like hiring more staff to keep our counselor to camper ratio low, and actively promoting our camp to families that may have children with special abilities. When it comes to working with high school youth, we have our Audubon Youth Leaders program. Our recruitment efforts for this program take place at alternative high schools, where students don't typically have the same access to programming or really are even invited to participate in this type of work. We also work closely with probation officers to enroll youth that they may be working with. At the center, when we hire seasonal staff, we try and hire young people that are typically not represented in the conservation field. And so what this means is it means spending more time as staff recruiting and interviewing, and once hired, mentoring those young people because they may not fit the mold. This ensures that diverse ideas are constantly being brought into our organization. And also, when it comes to hiring contractors and vendors at the center, we prioritize hiring local, minority, and women-owned businesses. And if at all possible, when it comes time to order supplies, we try and seek out local businesses to support them instead of using Amazon. Now, this type of work, it's important to point out, does take a commitment from the staff on the inside. Next slide, please. Another area that we're working to be more inclusive is through our habitat restoration.
A specific example of engaging an entire community in habitat restoration, as well as coastal resilience and emergency preparedness, is our work in Marin City, California. This is a vulnerable community that is going to feel the drastic effects of climate change first. The degraded wetland that you see in the photo doesn't drain properly for the community of Marin City, and it's really an eyesore for them. The community that sits behind this wetland, they have one road that leads in and out, and with king tides and seasonal flooding, it completely isolates their community. This leads to students being stranded at school, residents unable to commute to and from work, elderly community members blocked from important healthcare services, and medical and fire personnel cannot access the community during a flood. So what Audubon California is doing is tackling the impacts of climate change on this particular underserved community by co-facilitating a community-led restoration project. What this is going to look like on the ground is we'll be hosting and helping with public workshops right inside Marin City. We're going to hire conceptual artists and environmental engineers to design this wetland exactly the way the community wants to see it. And then we're going to engage the youth and the community members in the actual site restoration, from the biological surveys to site tours, and of course the overall design of the project. Next slide, please. Throughout my 6 years at Audubon, one of the most important things that I've learned is that conservation and environmental justice, they're really inextricably linked. Pulling the thread of one always tugs the other side. And searching for and nurturing non-traditional partnerships not only elevates the work we're doing at Audubon, but also positively impacts the communities that are in the Bay Area. An example of this is the work we're doing with a very specific mariner community in Richardson Bay. For decades, people have lived on their boats, which by letter of the law are illegally moored in Richardson Bay. So every time they drop an anchor, the eelgrass, which lives right below the surface of the water and is also a vital piece of the bay ecosystem and food chain, it becomes damaged. Now, the obvious solution would be to simply remove all the vessels and make the occupants leave Richardson Bay. However, with a health pandemic, as well as the cost of living in the Bay Area and the housing crisis, this would make people homeless. This isn't an option. So in order to protect eelgrass, as well as the thousands and thousands of water birds that rely on it, as well as do the right thing for the people that are living out there, we're partnering with local stakeholders to create several eelgrass protection zones in Richardson Bay. We're also using our own staff resources, so that's staff time as well as the use of our boat, to bring social workers to and from the mariners that are living out on Richardson Bay. And this is really just one example of how at Audubon we're weaving environmental justice and conservation into all of our mission-driven work. Next slide, please. Now, moving towards an action step for all the listeners on the webinar today, if you would like to get involved in making nature more accessible and equitable for everyone, please consider joining an affinity group that I'm part of. It's an Audubon-supported affinity group called Birdability. You can see the mission statement right on the screen. The group, what we're trying to do is bring birding opportunities to people of all abilities and ensuring that communities and events across the nation are inclusive of everyone. This particular group originally started to help people with mobility challenges know where to access accessible birding trails, but now it's growing and we're looking for more members. We meet once a month for an hour, and we have several steering committees within this affinity group that you can join. So in conclusion, next slide, this type of work has challenged Audubon California, I think, in all the right ways, as you've heard from my colleagues today, and has helped each of us become more inclusive and equitable in everything that we do. And with that said, I would love to hand it back over to my colleague, Megan, to wrap things up for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Casey. I am always incredibly inspired and awed by all of the work that you all are doing. So I'm going to leave this slide up here for just a moment. If folks want to capture, take a screenshot, or write down the email addresses. If you have additional questions for our presenters that we aren't able to get to today, this is a great way to follow up with them. And they've all offered to put their names up here, so please take advantage of it. And now if the panelists, all four of you, if you could turn your cameras back on and unmute yourself, we'll take a little bit of Q&A. Great. Excellent. Good to see you all here again. So I'm going to kick us off with the first question. And Pedro, you actually talked a little bit about this in your presentation. So maybe I'll have you answer first and then hear from the others. But a lot of what I would call big green historic conservation organizations like Audubon have not been known for being incredibly diverse, right? And that is something that Audubon is focusing on and trying to change. We've heard from all of you about the conservation work that we're doing to try to deal with equity and access, but what is Audubon as an organization trying to do to be more equitable and inclusive as part of its organization as a whole?
Sure. Okay, just making sure you can hear me. Well, yeah, that's a very good question, because, you know, there's the kind of like outward kind of work that we do, but also like as a large organization, Audubon, you know, our by the staff size alone, the California staff is huge compared to other places I've been in. So what we do is have, you know, intentional discussions around, you know, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. But also, I mean, I think it's you know, being real with our own like organizational history and being real with, you know, how our personal values can shape Audubon as an organization, rather than how the organization of Audubon can, you know, shape us as well too. And so we even discuss issues like job descriptions and like hiring practices, and even like discussing like some decision-making, like internal processes as well too, that might address some kind of like internal cultures around like power dynamics in an office workspace, or how that might also like negatively impact like workplace morale, you know, because ultimately, like if there is like a negative dynamic in the office around racial tensions or gender discrimination or so many other issues, like if we can't create a safe space to like, and clear venues to address these issues, you know, then we're not living up to our mission. And I think that also includes like holding, you know, the national organization as a whole accountable for its commitment to become an anti-racist organization as well. So I think that's something that we can all do, and welcome anyone from the public to support us doing that too.
Anyone want to add to that on the panel?
I can jump in for a second. As an organization, a couple of other things that we're doing is having, as Pedro mentioned, very intentional conversations, but we've also created an equity, diversity, and inclusion working group. And we meet once a month, as well as engage each other throughout the month on upcoming issues and things that we're reading in the news. And also as an organization, we've started for our annual goal process, making sure that each of our goals has some sort of equitable or inclusive component to it. And that's from the top down. Everyone is really being encouraged to weave equity into everything you do, whether you work in conservation, engagement, or even in a grants or finance department, finding ways to make your work more equitable.
Excellent. So let's take a question from the audience. We are living in unprecedented times, I think, to say the least, with everything that's going on. And one question that I've seen come up a couple times is, you know, how is COVID-19 impacting this work? So much of what you talked about is happening on the ground with communities in person. Mika, you had amazing pictures of people gathering, right? And things being accessible. Maybe you could kick us off a little bit about how COVID-19 has impacted your work.
Sure, yeah. So our work definitely looks very different right now than it did even just at the beginning of this year. A lot of our work does focus around these big, large community volunteer events and our community programming. So we have had to shift a lot of that to virtual platforms. It's definitely been a learning experience, but I think we have been able to stay connected. A lot of our partner organizations are also doing a lot of virtual programming, so there's been a lot of opportunity to kind of work together there and kind of plug into programs that other organizations are doing as well, and just really support each other through these times, because everyone is dealing with, you know, limited capacity and just trying to be creative in terms of how we can still work to engage our network and stay connected, and that everyone will know or be in the loop when we are ready to resume our in-person programming.
You know, I'd love to hear Frank build on this, because one of the things we've been talking about here is this connection of the environment with public health, right? And nowhere have we seen impacts from COVID that are also linked to how the Salton Sea is doing than the Imperial Valley. So Frank, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that connection and how COVID has impacted your community and the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. There is no other place in the Coachella Valley that has been negatively impacted by COVID more than the eastern Coachella Valley communities, the communities that live around the Salton Sea, because of the pre-existing conditions, public health issues, asthma, COPD. It is really difficult to engage them now into having in-person meetings, because it will only continue to exacerbate the already existing conditions. Nonetheless, we are trying to reach them out using internet platforms and connecting with other networks, which is already difficult enough. I mean, it was already difficult enough to engage them because, you know, the community doesn't have access. Not all community members have access to internet, social media, etc. So now with this crisis, it's sort of exacerbating the conditions. And that, I think, highlights the importance of how do we work organically with communities that traditionally haven't been engaged in the conservation movement.
Great, that's really great. I think I just saw my favorite question come across chat, and that is a question of how were each of you inspired to work for Audubon? And I will add I see smiles. Sorry for the hard question, but it's a good one. And I will add a little piece to that, you know, is also, you know, what inspires you about working at this intersection of equity, access, and biodiversity? So first, why Audubon? And then what inspires you about this line of conservation work particularly? And I'll open it up to see who's brave enough to go first on that one.
I can go first. What brought me to Audubon was the Audubon's willingness to cross some of those thresholds and in conservation. It is not birds alone, it is people and birds. And I am really happy that Audubon decided to invest organically in the local communities. In my opinion, coming to Audubon with different hats from social and environmental justice backgrounds, mental health. I was a pastor, so I've been a community organizer. For me, bringing those communities to the conversation was so important. And an Audubon willingness to embrace those communities and say, from now on, we're gonna tackle the conservation issues, bring in different voices, enfranchising different groups. For me, I think it was just natural, you know, to just come in and be part of this really great organization.
Others, you're not off the hook.
I can go next. You know, I originally came to Audubon, you know, very simply because I love birds. Some of my earliest memories are bird watching with my mom and filling bird feeders in our backyard. But as I've grown in my position and stayed at Audubon, what I love about this organization is how I get to combine everything that's important to me in one position. And so I get to come to work because I love birds, but then I get to bring teenagers out and teach them about birds. I get to dig around in the muck and plant coastal live oak trees with young people. And that's also part of my job. So I've just been able to really weave everything that's important to me as a human into my day-to-day 9-to-5 job.
I can go next. Yeah, thanks for this one. So for me, you know, I'm been a community organizer for quite a while, mainly because I like to get rowdy sometimes. So this has been like a really great venue for this, that just component of my personality, because, you know, I come from a background of teaching and engaging with community in that way, but also as an environmental justice organizer. And so, but also like everyone who like really knows me knows that like I love dogs and animals. So this is like a cool way that I'm able to, you know, like Casey said, kind of like synthesize some of those, you know, issues just in my life, because, you know, what I wanted to mention earlier is in the United States, for example, the conservation movement has very like well-deserved critiques of like being exclusionary, for example. But, you know, throughout the world, you know, conservation is not a, you know, certain one community issue, right? And so I feel like what my work in Audubon is just an extension of like my own culture and like my own background as well too in caring for the environment. And, you know, the environment has always impacted everyone. So this is more of a me kind of like doing what is normal for me to be doing too. So I'm really happy to be here.
Mika, you want to round us out on that one?
Yes. So for me, yeah, my background is actually in sociology. I really didn't know anything about birds or plants before I started working at Audubon. It's been an amazing experience to learn about all of that. But I was really drawn to the Debs Park Center because of the community engagement work that they do and the way that they really do invest in the community surrounding the park in a very genuine manner. So that really attracted me to the center. And yeah, it's just been a really incredible experience to be able to kind of play a role in this kind of movement towards building a more equitable and inclusive conservation movement, and to yeah, be able to participate in that has been extremely rewarding.
Great answers, all of you. You know, when people think of Audubon, hopefully not after this presentation, but generally when people think of Audubon, they think birds and habitat, right? Not necessarily communities or equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm wondering, you know, what are some of the lessons learned or challenges that you face? This isn't always easy work, right? These are sometimes hard conversations to have. And so I'd love to hear from any of you, actually, if you have a lesson learned or challenge that you'd be willing to share.
I can go first. Even though I am a native of this area, and I feel, you know, that I know the communities rather well, it is always a challenge, you know, to get to know those communities organically. We come with preconceived ideas of who those communities are and what is it that they need, but that is a wrong approach. What I learned is that we need to understand, listen to the needs and wants of those communities. They need to learn how to appreciate and respect the conservation movement, but they will not do it unless they learn, you know, that people like ourselves are willing to meet them halfway and find those common grounds. Working organically with those communities was important, but we need to make sure, you know, that we listen and we understand what are some of those local issues. Every community is different, and we need to make sure, you know, that we have a good understanding before we tend to, or we pretend to educate them or inform them of what is needed in conservation or equity or any of the any other movement.
Anyone want to add any lessons learned or challenges?
I can add on to that. You know, Frank, everything you just said absolutely resonates with the work we do in the Bay Area as well. I'm thinking specifically of the project we're helping with in Marin City. And I knew going into the project that relationship building was important with the community members, but I didn't know until we really got into it exactly how important it was. And that the relationship building needs to be first and foremost, and your restoration project and your deadlines, that's last. You need to be actively listening and hearing what the community wants, and sometimes coming at it from an angle that Audubon wouldn't typically take. Frank, you mentioned the health concerns of the people that live down in the Salton Sea. We hear that a lot in the Bay Area when it comes to water quality. And without addressing the health issues, it's really hard to get to improving a habitat for birds. We have to meet the people where they are first and listen to what their concerns are.
Words, Casey. Pedro, I saw you
Sure.
were going to do that.
Yeah, I can go. So I mean, just more broadly, like I've learned a bunch of things about birds. Like, so just that aside, But speaking from my position, you know, I think just like do no harm is I think something a value that's like super important just to like overall in the work to make sure like we're not supporting bills that like trade off like one issue versus another as just like one small example. But really, I think to get there is we need to like grow our movement for the environment and for climate action, because as much progress as we've made, looking outside your window right now is a very like fair reminder that we are, you know, honestly kind of behind, and so we need to like catch up with the issues. And I think to get there, it means increasing our advocacy potential on these important issues that kind of unite the 400 plus people, and you know who else is watching this webinar today. So I think that's maybe a takeaway for me.
Those are all really great. I mean, Casey, what you just said really resonates with me, and Pedro, like the fact that when you're worried about putting food on the table, or whether or not your family has clean drinking water, or if you have to evacuate because the fire is barreling down on your community, thinking about conservation, it is a luxury, right? That's not what's first of mind. And so we really need to be willing to meet people where they're at and understand and listen to their challenges before we start asking for them to go out and protect birds. The beauty of all of this, though, right, is that in protecting birds, we are protecting clean air and clean water, and thereby protecting human health. So I just have really loved the intersection of all of this. So one final question for all of you. I know this goes by so fast, I feel like we could talk about it forever. But as you look into the future and your work at the intersection of conservation and access and equity and these really crucial decisions, you know, what are you hopeful for? What do you see? Maybe we'll start with Mika on this one.
I mean, yeah, I mean, like, I think I'm hopeful to just see, you know, a lot more youth of color involved in the conservation movement, and really just advancing like a widespread shift in terms of thinking about conservation, and really advancing kind of a narrative where it's, you know, at the end of the day, it's really about connecting people to the land and connecting people to each other, and just building, you know, really strong networks of community stewardship as well. I think that is just, you know, a really hopeful future that I can envision, that I would love to see, and that I'm grateful to be able to, you know, work towards in this organization and in our work. So yeah, I guess that is what I would love to see.
Beautiful.
I can chime in. I think one of the big things I've learned the last 6 months, even as an introvert, is how important human connection is. You know, working from home and being on Zoom all day has really taught me how important it is to connect with my colleagues and my friends and my family. And I'm also seeing this desperate need from everyone that I interact with to be out in nature. And so I can't wait to harness that desire and that want, and turn that into really great conservation work in the future.
I can chime. Seeing how unfeasible it is to bring water from the Sea of Cortez or the Pacific Ocean, even for someone who lives, you know, just a few miles north of the sea, and have that lake full of water and recreation opportunities and so forth, and how infeasible that is. I envision and I would love to see better policies that include or are more sensitive to people and birds, people and wildlife. I would love to see opportunities for education, especially for minorities, you know, that otherwise will not be able to join the conversations. And lastly, I would love to see more opportunities to develop these organic programs with different sectors along the West, and pretty much, you know, all over, you know, the US.
Yeah, and just my 2 little cents of something that I'm kind of looking forward to is I think Casey hit the nail on the head, where, you know, the pandemic you know, re-strengthened, you know, some connections that, you know, we all had, or with the outdoors, but with the wildfires and stuff too, like even those spaces are, you know, are affected as well. So I think you know, there's a just larger like healing process that we all got to do with like 2020, and you know, the work side of me is like, yes, that also means like passing bills next year and like holding the state legislature accountable. Because if we can do that, like I'm looking forward to the day that we can do that. Because if we can, like, then we can like make some very like cutting edge like environmental wins for things that we all care about. You know, like water was a big thing. Like air is a big thing. You know, greenery is a big thing. And so all those like, you know, components like are essential to well-being, right? And I think well-being is important to call out versus or it's an important like more holistic like indicator for success, I guess is what I want to say. So I'm looking forward to getting to that point, and you know, and strengthening the bonds with my Audubon friends and kind of everyone I've been meeting along the way too. So this has been, you know, definitely a very fulfilling like time in my life, and I hope to, you know, contribute more.
Well, I think I can speak on behalf of all of the folks watching to just say it has been a privilege to learn a little bit about all of the incredible work that each of you are doing and leading within Audubon. And I just want to say thank you for the inspiration and for all of your hard work at these issues. Everything each of you just said also gives me hope, and I know that it's going to give everyone that is watching hope. So thank you so much for telling us a little bit about why biodiversity, equity, and access are so interlinked. And just as a reminder for everybody that joined, this has been recorded, and so you can go on to Facebook and rewatch this. I'm sure that makes all of our panelists slightly nervous, but they did so much of their great work. So please feel free to share the recording far and wide. And again, thank you everyone so much for your time and for joining this webinar that has been part of California's Biodiversity Week. With that, we'll sign off. Thanks all.